War has many turning points, moments when the rules change, when the old world cracks open and something new, something darker, steps through. In the First World War, one of those moments came not with a new gun or a new tactic or a new general, but with a cloud, a color, a smell, a weapon so shocking that even in a conflict defined by industrial slaughter, it felt like a violation of nature itself. This episode is about that moment when the air became a weapon, when the battlefield became a laboratory, and when thousands of young Canadians found themselves standing in the path of something the world had promised would never be used. It's a story of science and terror, of improvisation and endurance, and of how a single afternoon in April 1915 carved itself into the memory of a nation. This is not just military history. It's a story about breath, about fear, and about what happens when the most basic act of being alive becomes the most dangerous thing you can do. Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Memory and Valor. This one took a little longer to create, and thanks for waiting. Thanks for being here. It is a cool afternoon in January up here in Canada. And in keeping with our theme of following Canadian soldiers in the First World War, today we're going to look at something that was absolutely horrific and atrocious that occurred. This is the story of how Canadians met the Green Death, inverted commas, how they stood in the path of a weapon that the world had outlawed and dismissed as unthinkable, and how the encounter carved itself into the memory of a generation, searing, permanent, and utterly transformative. By the spring of 1915, the Western Front had ossified into a kind of industrial purgatory. Armies that had marched out with bands playing now found themselves buried in trenches, staring across a blasted no man's land at an enemy they could neither dislodge nor escape. For all its brutality, the war still clung to a thin membrane of 19th century convention, an illusion that certain lines would not be crossed. The Hague Convention had banned poison weapons, a gesture to Victorian ideals of fair play, as if mechanized slaughter could be governed by etiquette. For the Canadians, many barely half a year removed from the rhythms of prairie farms, logging camps, and city streets, the gas attack that arrived in April was not simply a tactical innovation, it was a revelation in the biblical sense, a tearing open of the world. The air itself, the one element no soldier could refuse, had been turned against them. What had once symbolized freedom, movement, and life became a medium of death. The sky was no longer neutral. The Canadian encounter with gas warfare unfolded in three escalating movements, each more corrosive than the last. The first was the era of shock and improvisation, beginning with the chlorine clouds at Ypres in 1915. In those early hours, survival depended on instinct, luck, and crude chemistry. Urine-soaked cloths pressed to faces, men coughing themselves back from the edge of suffocation. The second phase, stretching through 1916 and 17, was the age of industrialized gas warfare. Phosgene was colorless, efficient, and treacherously scented like new-mown hay, became a routine accompaniment to artillery barrages. Gas was no longer an aberration. It was part of the weather of war, an invisible pressure system that could roll in at any moment. The final phase, from 1917 to 1918, was the period of attrition. Mustard gas did not merely kill, it lingered, soaked into soil, clung to uniforms, and turned the battlefield itself into a toxic organism. At Passchendaele, the mud, already infamous, became a chemical slurry capable of burning flesh on contact. The landscape was no longer just dangerous, it was poisoned. Through war diaries, personal letters, medical reports, and newspaper editorials, we can trace the journey of the Canadian soldier from the first terror of the green cloud to the long, suffocating aftermath of gas lung in the years that followed. This isn't just a story about tactics or technology. It's the story about the sensory and psychological realities of men who inhaled the gases and lived long enough to remember it. To understand the impact of that first gas attack, we have to go back to April 1915 when the 1st Canadian Division was shifted from a quiet sector to the Ypres salient. The Ypres salient was a bulge in the Allied line, exposed on 3 sides, a place where geography itself seemed to conspire against them. And yet the atmosphere was deceptively calm. War diaries from those days read almost like pastoral interludes. Warm spring weather, men playing sports, writing letters, enjoying the rare quiet. The trenches were still understood through the lens of traditional infantry combat, so rifles, bayonets, artillery. The old rules still felt like they applied. But beneath that calm, something was moving. Intelligence reports whispered of a new German weapon, something chemical, something untested. The German High Command, desperate to break the deadlock, had hauled thousands of cylinders of chlorine gas to the front. This wasn't a tactical refinement, it was a strategic gamble, a decision to cross a line the world had promised never to cross again. If it worked, it might shatter the stalemate. If it failed, it would bring international condemnation. But in 1915, the Germans were willing to roll those dice. So on the late afternoon of April 22, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans unveiled their new weapon on the Western Front, and the timing was deliberate. They chose the hour when armies on both sides were settling into the tiny domestic rituals that had kept them tethered to sanity. The clinking of mess tins, the pouring of tea, the brief illusion that life still had rhythms, that the war could be paused just for a moment. And then the wind shifted. From the northeast came a slow moving wall, dense, unnatural, rolling across the fields with the steady purpose of a living thing. Men stared at it, confused. It wasn't smoke, it wasn't exactly fog. It was too thick, too green, and too deliberate. And then the first wave of it hit the French colonial troops on the Canadian left, and the screaming began. The Second Battle of Ypres became a pivot point, not just in the First World War, but in Canadian military history. It was the first time poison gas was used on such a scale in the West, and it shattered whatever remained of the old conventions of warfare. For the Canadians, many of them new to the trenches, still adjusting to the mud and the shell fire, this was their baptism by fire, or rather, their baptism by gas, chlorine gas. The green cloud rolled forward, swallowing trenches, choking men where they stood, turning lungs into raw, burning wounds. And in that moment, the war changed, the rules changed, the world changed. And the Canadians, standing in the path of that impossible weapon, had to decide whether they would break or whether they would hold. Lieutenant Colonel Elmore Cosgrave, a Canadian artillery officer, later tried to put words to the strangeness of it. The way a bright spring afternoon could be violated by something so alien, it felt like it had no place in the natural world. He described the cloud as gray-green, a phrase that appears again and again in the accounts of those who saw it. And it wasn't poetic language, it was a metaphor. The gas had a color, a shape, and really a presence. It seemed to move with purpose. It hugged the ground like a living thing, and it sank into the trenches because the gas was heavier than air. And it flowed forward with a kind of dreadful intelligence, as if it knew exactly where the men were hiding. The first to meet it were the French colonial troops, the Algerians and the Moroccans of the 45th Division and the 87th Territorial Division. They were positioned directly to the Canadians' left, and they had no warning, no masks, no doctrine, no idea what to do when the air itself turned hostile. One moment they were holding the line, the next they were engulfed. Their position didn't bend, it buckled. Then it collapsed entirely. What followed was a retreat so shocking that even hardened observers struggled to describe it. Cosgrave, watching from his battery, saw men in their prime, suddenly stagger, clutching at their throats, their eyes wide with panic. Some tried to run, some dropped where they stood, and some managed only a few final words. Words filled not with fear but with fury. Fury at an enemy willing to unleash something so monstrous, so far outside the accepted boundaries of war that it felt like a betrayal of civilization itself. For Cosgrave, that moment marked the beginning of something dark and permanent. He would later admit that he learned to hate on that day. And when he wrote those words, they carried the ornate moral vocabulary of a Victorian raised to believe that war, for all its brutality, still had limits, that there were lines you did not cross, that there was such a thing as decency, even in killing. The gas cloud shattered that illusion. The years that followed, years of what Cosgrave called soul deadening trench warfare, only deepened the mark left by that first encounter with chemical weapons. The green fog didn't just break a section of the Allied line, it broke something inside the men who witnessed it. Something moral, something psychological, something that would never fully heal. And in that sense, the first gas attack at Ypres wasn't just a tactical event. It was a moment of transformation, the point where the war shed the last remnants of the old world and stepped fully into the new, dragging the men with it, whether they were ready or not. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Canadian newspapers, soldiers' letters, even the official communiques reached for the same language: fiends, cowards, barbarians. It wasn't just outrage, it was a sense of betrayal. On April 22nd, 1915, when the Germans unleashed chlorine gas at Ypres, they crossed a line the world believed was fixed and sacred. The Hague Convention of 1899 had explicitly banned asphyxiating gases. Everyone understood why. These were not weapons meant to wound or disable, they were instruments of terror designed to unmake the human body from the inside out. To contemporaries, gas wasn't just another escalation, it was an atrocity. When the chlorine cloud rolled across no man's land that evening, within minutes, the French line simply ceased to exist, and in its place opened up a 6.5-kilometer gap, an open door into the Allied position. And standing directly beside that door were the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Division suddenly found itself holding the hinge of the entire front. If they gave way, the Germans could swing around behind the British, roll up the line, and take Ypres. The fall of the salient in April 1915 wasn't just a tactical setback waiting to happen, it was the kind of collapse that could have reshaped the war. What followed over the next 48 hours became the origin story of the Canadian Corps. It's the moment Canadians point to when they talk about identity forged in fire. But beneath the mythology was a biological nightmare. Chlorine gas is a pulmonary irritant of the most awful kind. When inhaled, it reacts with the moisture in the lungs to form hydrochloric acid. The victim doesn't bleed and doesn't necessarily burn. They drown slowly, internally. Their lungs fill with fluid as the body tries desperately to protect itself. And the Canadians had no respirators, no masks, no training, nothing but instinct and desperation. Men urinated on handkerchiefs, pressed them to their faces, and hoped that the ammonia would neutralize the gas long enough to stay alive. Others wrapped their mouths in wet socks or tore strips from their shirts or puttees. It wasn't heroism so much as improvisation in the face of annihilation. Yet somehow, in that choking green haze they held, they counterattacked, they plugged the line, they bought the Allies time. The defense of the Ypres salient in April 1915 wasn't clean or glorious. It was chaotic, terrifying, and fought in conditions no soldier had been prepared to face. But it became the crucible in which the Canadian Corps earned that reputation, a moment when ordinary men, confronted with a weapon the world had declared too monstrous to use, refused to break. The solution, when it finally came, didn't come from some grand tactical insight or a brilliant staff officer in the chateau miles behind the lines. It came from medical officers, the men who understood, at least in theory, what chlorine actually was. It also came from NCOs and officers in the line who had backgrounds in chemistry. And in that moment, chemistry mattered more than courage. Captain Francis Scrimger of the 14th Battalion, a man who would earn the Victoria Cross within hours, is credited with giving one of the most infamous, most desperate orders in Canadian military history. Scrimger wasn't dealing with tactics or formations, he was dealing with biology. He knew that chlorine, when it hit the moisture in the lungs, turned into hydrochloric acid. He also knew that ammonia could blunt that reaction. And in a battlefield where nothing was available, where the men had no masks and no respirators, no equipment of any kind, there was only one source of ammonia they could produce on command. A gunner from the 9th Field Battery remembered the moment with a kind of stunned clarity. He said, Captain Scrimger was rushing up and down, telling everyone to urinate on our pocket handkerchief and tie it over our mouth. Imagine that scene. The gas is rolling in, the men are choking, panicking, clawing at their throats. And here comes the medical officer shouting an order that sounds insane, until you realize it's the only thing standing between you and a slow chemical death. This wasn't gallantry. This wasn't the stuff of recruiting posters. This was war stripped down to its most primitive, humiliating core. The men who had marched into Belgium with polished boots and patriotic speeches were now crouched in the trenches, soaking their own handkerchiefs in urine and pressing them to their faces, hoping that this crude, degrading act might keep their lungs from dissolving. If there had been any romance left in the war by April 1915, this moment killed it. The battlefield had become a laboratory, and the soldiers were the test subjects. Scrimger's order wasn't heroic in the traditional sense, but it was the kind of brutal, necessary improvisation that kept men alive in a world where the rules had just changed forever. And that's the part that sticks with you. Not the medals, not the speeches, but the image of an entire division learning in real time that the modern battlefield was going to demand things from them that no one had ever imagined. Things that felt more like survival in a disaster zone than anything resembling the old idea of war. Harry Routhier was born December 6, 1899, in Chelsea, Quebec. Lying about his age, Mr. Routhier joined the army at the age of 16. After his training in Regina, Saskatchewan, he joined the 217th Battalion and was later transferred to the 46th Battalion. He gave an undated interview to Veterans Affairs Canada's for the Heroes Remember project and spoke about his experience of being gassed in April 1915, before the invention of respirators or anything of that nature.
Well, I remember we were on the ready to go over the top, and this word is gas. And that's the first attack again. And they told us to wet our handkerchiefs and hold it over. We didn't have no masks or anything then, see. So that's what we did, and that's what saved some of us, and a lot of them died.
One of the most vivid accounts of that moment comes from Lieutenant Armin Frank Norris, a young Canadian officer whose correspondence home was published only after his death in 1918. Norris had a way of describing the front line that stripped away every layer of romance and left only the raw, unvarnished truth. In one letter, he captured the scene with almost shocking clarity. Quote, "When the gas came and only wet handkerchiefs could enable them to hang on, they wet them in the only way they could, with urine, and tied them round their noses and mouths. Just imagine men doing that, not to save their lives, but to save their trenches." End quote. That distinction, that the men were willing to endure this foul expedient, not simply to survive, but to hold the line, reveals something essential about the mindset in those trenches. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting to prevent the collapse of the front, to stop the Germans from pouring through the gap left by the shattered French units. The advice whispered from man to man was as blunt as the situation itself. Piss on a rag and stuff it in your mouth if you want to live. It was a crude, desperate improvisation, and even then it was only partially effective. The ammonia in the urine could blunt the chlorine, but it couldn't stop it. Men who followed the order still collapsed, they still choked, and still died with their lungs filling with fluid and froth. Others survived, but carried the damage for the rest of their lives. Scarred lungs, chronic coughing, a permanent reminder that the modern battlefield had become a place where the air itself could turn against you. Among the Canadians who witnessed the evolution of gas war firsthand was Thomas Wood. Born in Edinburgh in 1898 to a family of printers, he emigrated to Canada as a boy and grew up in Ottawa, Ontario. When war came in 1914, he was just 16. Too young by any reasonable standard, but like so many others, he left school and joined the newly mobilized 1st Battery. He trained at Valcartier, Quebec, crossed the Atlantic that autumn, and by February 1915, he was in France with the 57th Battery of the 15th Field Artillery Brigade. Wood's war carried him through some of the defining moments of the Canadian experience. He took part in the bombardment at Vimy. He saw the German gas apparatus at Ypres, the cylinders, the pipes, the machinery that turned chemistry into a weapon. He was wounded by shrapnel in the hip and leg, and somehow he survived it all. He lived into the late 20th century, dying in Vancouver in 1988, a man who had seen the first gas clouds with his own eyes and carried those memories across an entire lifetime. Now, thanks to Veterans Affairs Canada, we can hear his voice, one of the last living witnesses to the moment when modern warfare revealed just how far it was willing to go. Let's listen to his recollections.
When they sent the gas over, they shot gas, how they sent the gas over was through little pipes. When they shoot the gas, they bury the pipe itself. And you'd only see one shot of the pipe, you see. So they'd wait until there was a sort of a wind going our way, if you know what I mean. And on we'd go there. And of course, you're gone, even your horses, they died right in the spot, practically. What we used to do, without a word of a lie, we used to leak on our shirt, tear our shirt in pieces, leak on it, and shove it all over our face. We had nothing like you have today, there was no gas mask. Yeah. Some guys, I've seen some guys just stand at the front line there with a rifle in their hand, and you just touch them, they'd fall over after they got the gas, you see. You just touch them.
If April 22nd was the shock, then April 24th was the bludgeoning, the moment when the Germans stopped testing the limits of this new weapon and began using it like a hammer. This time the gas didn't drift towards someone else's sector. It came straight for the Canadians at St. Julien. And when it hit, the fighting collapsed into something primal and close quarters, a kind of trench-line street brawl fought in a world where the air itself was poison. One of the clearest voices from that week of chaos belongs to Private Albert Edward Roscoe of the 8th Battalion. On May 13th, 1915, writing to a Mrs. Caleb Bateman back in Stirling, Ontario, Roscoe tried to explain what the counterattack felt like. He wrote, quote, "Although they used gases to shift us, we came back with such force that we mowed them down like a mowing machine mows down hay." End quote. That image, a mowing machine cutting through hay, is almost too vivid. It speaks to the density of the German assaults, the closeness of the fighting, and the terrifying efficiency of Canadian rifle fire. But what makes Roscoe's letter so human is how quickly the tone shifts. The bravado evaporates. The cost becomes impossible to ignore. Quote, I do not know how I came to be alive today. My kit was blown clear off my back. I can't help but shed tears when I think of my close comrades that have been killed on the field of battle. End quote. This is the emotional whiplash of the First World War. One moment you're part of a machine, the next you're a survivor, wondering why you're still breathing when the man beside you isn't. And the toll was staggering. In just 48 hours, the Canadian division suffered more than 6,000 casualties, roughly a third of its strength, with about 2,000 killed. Today, the St. Julien Memorial, the brooding soldier, stands on that ground. Its inscription is blunt, almost biblical in its simplicity. It reads, This column marks the battlefield where 18,000 Canadians withstood the first German attacks. 2,000 fell and here lie buried. While the front line reeled, another battle was folding behind the scenes, a scientific one. Lieutenant Colonel George Naismith, a hydrologist and commander of the No. 5 Canadian Mobile Laboratory, was near the front when the first gas cloud rolled in. Most men instinctively moved away from the green-yellow fog. Naismith moved toward it. He watched the cloud drift across the field, 3 miles long, low to the ground, shimmering with that sickly color, and he recognized it almost immediately. The gas looked and smelled like chlorine, he wrote. He examined the retreating French troops, noting their symptoms with clinical precision. Irritated throat followed by a frothy cough, leaving the soldiers gasping for air. End quote. His report was the first definitive identification of chlorine gas on the Western Front, and that diagnosis mattered. It allowed the British War Office to begin producing alkaline impregnated pads and the first crude protective helmets, the so-called hypo helmets, designed specifically to counter chlorine. It was the beginning of the arms race between chemistry and survival. But for the Canadians, gas was never just one thing. It evolved. It adapted. It became more lethal and more deceptive as the war dragged on. They faced 3 primary agents, remember: chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, each with its own personality, its own signature, and its own way of breaking a soldier down. Chlorine was the brute force weapon of 1915. You could see it coming, a green-yellow cloud rolling across the landscape like a living thing. It attacked the mucous membranes of the nose, throat, lungs, and turning the moisture inside the body into the hydrochloric acid. Victims weren't burned or blasted apart, they drowned, standing upright, choking on their own fluids. Their faces turned blue or purple as they fought for breath. And the Canadians weren't the only ones to face it. To understand the full horror of these early gas attacks, it helps to hear from the British troops who stood in the same trenches, breathing the same poisoned air. In an interview recorded in the 1980s by Peter Hart of the Imperial War Museum, George Ashurst of the 2nd Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers recalled what it was like when the chlorine hit. His voice, decades older, but still carrying the weight of that moment, describes the panic, the burning lungs, the desperate scramble for anything that might keep the gas out. It's a reminder that this wasn't just a Canadian ordeal, it was a shared catastrophe experienced by thousands of men who suddenly found themselves fighting an enemy they couldn't shoot at, they couldn't bayonet, and couldn't outrun. Let's now turn to Ashurst's recollection, a voice reaching across time from the trenches of 1915.
The 2nd of May, Sunday, afternoon, tea time. Across from St. Julian, looking right across, and we saw this smoke coming out of German trenches, and somebody said, "Look, there's smoke coming out of them trenches. Look at young Gurkhas attacking." And they flew back again, the Gurkhas. So somebody said, "It's gas." No sooner had he said that than somebody shouts, "It's coming over here too," you know. it's coming over here. Well, we've not been on the rise, we didn't know, you see. It was the front trench lads that shouted, gas. Of course, it doesn't take it long to come across with the wind, you know. Comes floating across. And, well, everybody was grabbing their handkerchiefs, you know, coughing and spitting by then. And wanted to attempt to get up the back of the trench, and the officer was there, get back, you know, with his revolver, get back, you. Stand to.
Alfred Bromfield was a British NCO with the 2nd Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers, part of the 12th Brigade of the 4th Division, and he was there on May 2nd, 1915, when the Germans unleashed yet another gas attack on St. Julien. He wasn't alone. Men like Private George Ashurst, whom we just heard from, and Lieutenant Victor Hawkins stood in the same choking fog, fighting for breath, fighting to hold the line, and fighting to understand what kind of war they had been thrown into. Nearly half a century later, in 1963, the BBC sat down with all three of these men and asked them to remember. And what came out wasn't polished history or patriotic myth-making. It was raw memory, the kind that had lived in their lungs and their nightmares for decades. These were the voices of men who had watched the air turn poisonous and the world around them dissolve into panic and survival. Their recollections don't need embellishment, they don't need interpretation. They speak with the authority of people who were there, who felt the burn in their throats and the terror of not knowing whether the next breath would be their last. We'll continue on with Victor Hawkins, an officer in the 2nd Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers, as he recalls what it was like when the gas rolled in and the line began to buckle.
And about 4:45, I went along to my company headquarters to have a cup of tea. I'd only just poured out my tea when the sentry in front called out, "Will you come and look, sir?" So I got up to look. And out of the German trenches, I suppose about 600 to 800 yards away, great jets of yellow cloud were shooting up into the air like water out of a hose. We had come up and seen the effect of the first gassing on our way, so we knew what it was. As the gas went up into the air out of these jets, it formed together into a cloud and dropped, being heavier than air, onto the ground, and then started rolling towards us, with a slight breeze behind it, not a very strong wind. And we were very soon enveloped in this thick, yellow, filthy cloud and could see nothing.
So now we'll turn to Alfred Bromfield, the other veteran of the 2nd Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers, a man who stood in the same poisoned air and the same collapsing front during those desperate days around St. Julien. He also sat down with Peter Hart for BBC in 1963 to talk about what he had seen, and what emerged was raw, unfiltered memory, shaped by nearly 50 years of living with the ghosts of that battlefield. Bromfield's recollections add yet another layer to our understanding of those early gas attacks. Where some accounts emphasize the chaos and the others' terror, his perspective blends both. The confusion of men trying to fight while their lungs burned, the disbelief that such a weapon could exist, and the grim determination to hold the line, even as the world around them dissolved into this choking fog. So let's hear his voice now.
The gas clouds are all joined up into one, and they were at that time bright yellow, but they were gradually turning green then. Well, our officer gave the order, rapid fire, just that, no more. We all opened up as fast as we could go. It was a real mad minute, I'll tell you. Blazing away there, continually firing into the gas, although we didn't know whether we was hitting anybody or it was just a blind with the gas coming over. Mind you, we had no protection at all other than our own inventiveness. There was no such thing as gas masks in those days, so the men started urinating on either handkerchiefs or the caps, their soft caps, and covering their mouths with those long enough to get a good deep breath, and then continued firing. And that's how it went on, while the gas was still pouring over the top of the trench. and of course coming down into the trench naturally.
In the chaos of the gas attack, one figure rises out of the haze with almost mythic clarity. John Lynn, Jackie, to the men of the 2nd Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't a man with a famous pedigree. He certainly wasn't someone the newspapers were watching. He was a private, a professional soldier who had already given more than a decade of his life to the army before the war even began. Born in Forest Hill, London in 1887, Lynn enlisted young and served from 1901 to 1913 before rejoining when the war broke out. He was 27 years old in the spring of 1915, old by the standards of the trenches, seasoned, steady, the kind of man other soldiers instinctively watched when things went bad. And on May 2nd, 1915, things went very, very bad. When the Germans released that second wave of chlorine gas, the line at St. Julien began to buckle, men were stumbling back, choking, half blind, coughing up foam. But Lynn stayed exactly where he was, at his machine gun post, the one fixed point in a world dissolving into green-yellow fog. According to the official account, he was already almost overcome by the deadly fumes when the German advance began to press forward. But instead of abandoning his position, he did something extraordinary. Unable to see the enemy through the gas, he hauled his machine gun higher up onto the parapet so he could fire blindly into the advancing line. He kept the gun working by touch alone, sweeping it back and forth, buying precious seconds for the men behind him. That act, that stubborn refusal to give ground, checked the German advance. It wasn't just bravery, it was the kind of defiance that stiffens the spine of everyone who sees it. His comrades later said that Lynn's stand had a great effect on the men around him, holding them together in a moment when everything else was falling apart. But courage like that has a cost. Jackie Lynn was found the next day, the 3rd of May, 1915, dying from the effects of the gas he had fought through. He never left his post. For that final stand, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and even the Russian Cross of St. George, a rare trifecta of recognition for a private soldier. His original grave was later lost in the fighting, but a memorial stone now stands in Grootbeek, British Cemetery, bearing the inscription chosen by his family. Place is vacant in our home that never can be filled. Among the Lancashire Fusiliers, his name became something spoken quietly, almost reverently, not as legend but as memory, a reminder of what one man can do when the world is collapsing around him. And now to understand how Lynn's stand looked to the men who were there, choking, firing, stumbling, and somehow holding the line, we turn to the voices of those who witnessed it. Voices such as Private George Ashurst, Lieutenant Victor Hawkins, and Alfred Bromfield all remember that day, each carrying a different piece of the same nightmare. We'll hear from them together now.
The first thing I remember was a man called Jackie Lynn, who was a machine gunner with us, getting his gun and putting it up on top of the parapet and getting up behind it without putting his so-called gas mask on.
It was over the ridge, and I never saw over that ridge, because Jackie Lynn was on that ridge there in front of us. Jackie Lynn was there with his machine gun.
And anyway, we stopped Jerry. He must have been coming over, because when we looked out over the open ground again, there was quite a number of them lying out there. Some of them wriggling about, they've been wounded, and quite a number, of course, dead. But I think the greatest havoc was caused by one of our machine gunners, Jackie Lynn. He was out to the right of our lines in a position where he could enfilade the whole ground in front of the German trenches. And he'd worked his machine gun the whole time, on his own, because his number 2 and 3 had already conked out with the gas. And he was firing there on his own, and they had to drag him away from their gun, pull him away from it. And, of course, when they got him back, he lasted about 3 days, and he died poison gas. But he got the VC for what he did.
I suppose we were in that gas cloud about 15 minutes altogether. And then, quite suddenly, why one got a breath of fresh air, and it was the most marvellous feeling. And one fairly sucked it in. And it was just at that moment that I turned round and I saw Jackie Lynn. He'd kept his gun going right the way through, and he was carried past me in the ditch behind me on a stretcher, blue in the face, dying. I've never seen a chap blue like that, but they were all blue. All these men who died of this gas burning were blue in the face. The effect of this gas was to form a sort of foamy liquid in one's lungs, and more or less in time drown one, if you were unlucky. Because a lot of the men died pretty quickly from this beastly foam coming up from their lungs. And out of 250 men we started with at 5 o'clock, we were very soon down to about 40 or 50 men. Some were dead, some were dying, and the others were on the ground.
We can thank BBC for that compilation of the three veterans talking about their experience that we just heard. So by late 1915, the war had entered a new phase, one where chemistry, not just artillery, dictated who lived and who died. The Germans introduced phosgene, a gas that represented not just an escalation, but an evolution. Chlorine had been brutal, but at least it had the decency to announce itself. It hit the senses like a punch, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. Phosgene was different. It was subtle, deceptive. It drifted in quietly, wrapped in a scent that felt almost nostalgic. Soldiers described it as musty hay, cut grass, or green corn, the smells of home, of harvest, of summers long before the war. And that was the trap. A man could inhale a lethal dose and feel fine. He could laugh, eat, write a letter, clean his rifle. Hours later, sometimes a full day later, he would suddenly collapse as his lungs filled with fluid. Death didn't come in the moment of exposure. It stalked him afterwards. That delay created a new kind of terror on the Western Front. The paranoia seeped into everything. A breeze carrying the smell of a nearby farm could send an entire platoon scrambling for their helmets. A haystack became a threat. A field of crops became a warning. Even the smell of a soldier's own damp uniform could trigger panic. The landscape of Flanders, once familiar, almost comforting, became a sensory minefield. A Second World War poster, drawing on the hard lesson of the first, captured the dread perfectly. It read, "When you smell green corn, it's phosgene gas." And if phosgene was the silent killer, mustard gas, introduced in July 1917, was something far more insidious. It didn't drift in like a cloud, and it didn't vanish with the wind. It was a liquid, heavy and oily, that clung to the earth itself. It seeped into shell holes, soaked into the mud, coated the duckboards and the trench walls. It could remain active for days, even weeks, especially in the cold, wet misery of Passchendaele. And mustard gas didn't just choke, it attacked the body in ways that felt almost medieval. It burned any moist area, so the eyes, the armpits, the groin, the lungs. A man could be blinded simply by walking through a contaminated patch of ground. Crawling through the mud, which they often had to do, could leave him with chemical burns so severe they peeled away the skin in sheets. The smell varied: garlic, horseradish, mustard. But whatever the description, the effect was the same. Mustard gas turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. And the paranoia deepened. Men learned to fear the mud, the mist, the morning dew. They hesitated before picking up a rifle or a shovel. They avoided puddles. They watched where they stepped. A trench that looked quiet and harmless could be a death trap. A shell hole could be a pool of poison. The war had already taken their friends, their innocence, and their sense of safety, and now it took their trust in the world around them. The next audio segment comes from an interview recorded decades later with an unnamed veteran of the First World War. In his voice, you can hear the memory of mustard gas, not as historical detail, but as something lived and something endured, something that never quite left him. He describes what it did to the men who encountered it and what it meant to fight in a world where even the mud can kill you. Let's listen to his account.
And because it had such a faint smell, the troops tended to take no notice of it. And when they did feel their eyes smarting, they were too late. It was a dreadful substance. If they got it on the soles of their boots, it would go through and burn their feet. If they went with some on their boots into a dugout and slept there, they would gas everyone in the dugout. One man could go in with some on his boots into a hut and gas everyone in the hut.
The history of gas war is, in many ways, the history of a desperate arms race, a duel between offensive chemistry and defensive improvisation. Every time one side found a new way to poison the air, the others scrambled to invent something, anything, that might keep their soldiers alive for a few more minutes. The Canadian soldiers' kit evolved at breakneck pace, moving from the primitive to the complex in the span of months. After the first gas attacks at Ypres, the British Army issued what was optimistically called the hypo helmet. In reality, it was little more than a flannel sack soaked in sodium hyposulfate, glycerin, and H2O with a tiny window to see through. It was claustrophobic, suffocating, and reeked of chemicals. One Canadian soldier said it smelled like last year's birdseed, which is a polite way of saying it stank of rot and dampness. But the thing just didn't smell bad. It hurt. When a soldier would sweat, the chemicals in the fabric would run, burning the forehead, stinging the eyes. It was a device that punished the wearer almost as much as it protected them. But in 1915, it was all they had. By 1916, the British introduced something far more sophisticated, the small box respirator. The SBR was a rubberized face mask connected by a hose to a chemical filter canister carried in a haversack. It was, for its time, a marvel, highly effective against chlorine and phosgene, provided the soldier could get it on in seconds. That provided became a matter of life and death. Gas alarms, gongs, horns, and rattles became the soundtrack of trench life. A 1918 diary from the 3rd Battalion captures the monotony and the urgency. Quote, "Training was carried out today as follows. Small box respirator drill." End quote. Every day, over and over, because hesitation meant death. But the SBR came with a price. It was stifling, exhausting, and disorienting. The lenses fogged instantly. The hose restricted head movement, and breathing felt like sucking air through a wet rag. Soldiers described the sensation of fighting in one as like drowning on dry land. And the masks themselves changed the look of the men wearing them. Rows of soldiers, their faces hidden behind rubber and glass, became faceless, goggle-eyed creatures, anonymous, insect-like, stripped of humanity. The gas war didn't just kill, it transformed the living into something unrecognizable. There's another part of the Canadian gas story that rarely gets told. The part where the Canadians weren't just victims of gas, but users of it. By 1917, the Canadian Corps had fully integrated gas projectors into their artillery planning. The lead up to the Battle of Vimy Ridge offers a stark example of how unpredictable, how treacherous offensive gas operations could be. In March 1917, before the main assault on Vimy, the Canadians planned a massive gas raid. The idea was simple. Unleash phosgene and chlorine on the German forward positions, let the gas do the killing, and send in the infantry afterward to mop up, meaning gather intelligence, destroy dugouts, finish off any survivors. On paper, it looked like a clean, clinical operation. In reality, it was a disaster. Gas canisters were installed in the front lines, waiting for a favorable wind. But the Germans shelled the Canadian trenches, puncturing some of the cylinders before they could be released. A sentry noticed the gas leaking and woke his platoon, but hesitated to raise a full alarm, afraid the Germans would hear it and know what was coming. That hesitation cost lives. Canadian soldiers were gassed in their own trenches before the attack even began. When the gas was finally released in the 12th Brigade sector, the wind, that fickle, uncontrollable partner in every gas operation, shifted. The cloud stalled, then drifted back into the Canadian lines. Maurice Bracewell of the 102nd Battalion remembered the moment with blunt clarity. He said, quote, "Our front lines got all the gas. The front trenches were saturated with it." End quote. The infantry went forward expecting to find dead Germans. Instead, they found fully alert defenders wearing their own masks, rifles fixed, bayonets ready. The Canadians walked straight into a killing ground. One raider recalled the enemy tightly packed in their trenches with bayoneted rifles aimed at the Canadian lines. The gas had failed them, and they paid the price in blood. This episode stands as a grim counter-narrative to the triumph of Vimy Ridge. It reveals the cynicism that crept into the ranks whenever wonder weapons were mentioned. The soldiers had seen too many things go wrong, too many promises dissolve in the wind. Gas was unpredictable. It was treacherous. It didn't care who it killed. And on that day in March 1917, it killed Canadians. The true cost of the gas war wasn't found in casualty tables or after-action reports. It lives in the private writings of the men who endured it, the diaries, the correspondence, the memoirs written years later when the nightmares still hadn't faded. These accounts reveal something beyond fear. It's a psychological hardening, a sense of alienation so profound that many veterans later said that they felt like strangers in their own lives. Will Bird, a soldier in the 42nd Battalion, the Black Watch, captured this better than almost anyone. His memoir, entitled And We Go On, is often described as bracingly grim, but even that feels like an understatement. Bird doesn't give you the war of statues and ceremonies. He gives you the war as it looked from the place of the mud, from the dugouts, from the places where men died anonymously. He describes the battlefield not as a place of glory, but as a charnel house where men were shredded to fragments. For Bird, gas wasn't a separate horror. It was part of a single, continuous nightmare where the mud itself seemed made of human remains. And in Bird's writing, you can see the real terror of gas. Not just the fear of dying, but the fear of how you might die. Not a clean wound, not a quick end, but a wretched death, choking in the dark, lungs filling, unable to scream for help. A death that left no heroic last words, only the sound of a man drowning on dry land. Canon Frederick Scott, the senior chaplain of the 1st Canadian Division, offers a different perspective. Not a soldier's, but something just as intimate. Scott wasn't in the firing line, but he was everywhere the dying were. He moved through advanced dressing stations like a father among his sons, offering comfort where comfort was almost impossible. His description of the Vimy battlefield captures the environmental devastation that mirrored the chemical destruction inside the human body. Quote, "The whole of that region looked as if a volcanic upheaval had broken the crust of the earth. The wire was twisted and torn." To Scott, the battlefield itself seemed wounded, torn open, scorched, poisoned. He witnessed what he called the ungodly havoc of the war, a phrase that feels almost inadequate for what he saw. His memoir, entitled The Great War as I Saw It, is filled with moments where faith collided with the realities of industrial killing. And nowhere was that collision sharper than in the presence of gas. How do you offer spiritual comfort to a man who is drowning in his own fluids? What prayer do you say over someone whose lungs are dissolving? What words can possibly bridge the gap between the world they left behind and the one they're dying in? Scott never found a perfect answer, but he stayed. He held hands and he whispered prayers. He bore witness. And in doing so, he became part of the emotional architecture of the Canadian Corps, a reminder that even in a war where the air itself could kill you, someone would still kneel beside you in your final moments. The trauma of gas didn't just scar lungs, it reshaped the psychology of the Canadian Corps. It hardened them. It stripped away whatever remained of the early war idealism, the talk of adventure and duty and doing one's bit. In its place grew something colder, darker, and far more dangerous. One anonymous Canadian soldier captured that transformation with brutal honesty. Reflecting on the loss of comrades to gas, he wrote, quote, We who inhaled less of the filthy noxiousness grew black with a deadlier hate. Then, with what strength we could gather, did we kill and kill and kill. More, we butchered savagely. End quote. There is no romance in that sentence, no euphemism. It's the voice of a man who has crossed a psychological threshold. Gas didn't just kill, it removed the possibility of mercy. If the enemy was willing to poison the air, to make men drown in their own lungs, then the Canadians were willing to respond in kind. The filthy noxiousness became the catalyst for a new kind of warfare, one where restraint felt like a luxury no one could afford. And while the soldiers hardened, the home front seized on the gas attacks with a different kind of fervor. For the Allied press, gas was a propaganda gift. Canadian newspapers framed the battle not as a tragedy, but as a national awakening. The Globe ran headlines like St. Julien, a glorious page in Canadian history, transforming the horror into a story of heroic endurance. The gas attacks became proof in the public imagination that the Germans were not just enemies, but barbarians. It was in this atmosphere of outrage and fear that the myth of the crucified soldier took root. Stories circulated that a Canadian soldier had been pinned to a barn door with bayonets by German troops during the fighting around Ypres. Historians now believe it was likely a fabrication or a grotesque exaggeration of field punishments, but the truth mattered less than the emotional resonance. The story fit perfectly into the narrative established by the gas, that the enemy was capable of anything. Poison gas and crucifixion became twin symbols of German diabolism, fueling a propaganda war that shaped Canadian memory long after the trenches were gone. But for the men who survived, the war didn't end when the armistice was signed in 1918. The medical legacy of chemical exposure was a slow motion tragedy that unfolded over decades. Soldiers who survived the initial attacks often carried permanent respiratory damage. Gas lung became a catch all term for chronic bronchitis, emphysema, fibrosis, conditions that slowly strangled men long after the war had ended. Scar tissue in the lungs made veterans highly susceptible to tuberculosis and pneumonia. A simple winter cold could become a death sentence. Many lived with a constant cough, a tightness in the chest, a sense that they were never quite getting enough air. Official records list 11,536 gas casualties in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, but historians widely agree this number is a fiction of bureaucracy. Countless men never reported minor exposures, the burning throat, the brief coughing fit, that later developed into chronic, debilitating conditions. The green clouds of Ypres drifted away in 1915, but for thousands of Canadians, the war stayed inside them, in their lungs, in their breath, in the slow, suffocating decline that followed them into middle age and beyond. Medical officers left some of the most harrowing descriptions of what gas could do to the human body. They wrote of men, quote, propped up against a wall. Their color was black, green, and blue, tongues hanging out and eyes staring. End quote. These weren't battlefield wounds in the traditional sense. They were the physical signatures of suffocation, the body's final frantic attempt to breathe in a world where the air had turned against it. For those who survived the initial attack, the suffering didn't end. It simply changed shape. Shortness of breath, persistent rattling cough, the chest that felt permanently tight, a reduced capacity for labor. Many veterans describe the sensation as never getting a full breath again, and in an era when physical labor was the backbone of working class life, that meant more than discomfort. It meant unemployment, poverty, a slow decline. The Great War Veterans Association, the GWVA, found itself fighting a second war after 1918, this time against the Canadian government. The battle was over disability pensions, and it was bitter. The burden of proof lay entirely with the veteran. He had to demonstrate that his post-war illness was directly caused by his service. But gas exposure was chaotic, undocumented, and often invisible on paper. If a soldier had been gassed but not evacuated to a hospital, a common occurrence in the confusion of 1915 to 1917, there was no official record, no notation, no evidence. A veteran might claim stomach trouble caused by gas inhalation, only to be denied because no report of gas existed in his file. The Pension Commission viewed disability through a very narrow lens. Could the man work? Could he lift? Could he perform menial labor? If the answer was yes, even barely, the claim was often rejected. Veterans argued that their quality of life had been destroyed, that they lived with the constant pain, constant breathlessness, constant fear of the next winter, cold turning into pneumonia. The GWVA called gas exposure a hidden wound, one the state was refusing to acknowledge. Sounds familiar, even in this day and age, but that's another podcast episode. This struggle for recognition is a crucial final chapter in the story of Canadian gas warfare. It reveals that the gas attack at Ypres didn't end in April 1915. It continued to claim victims well into the 20s and 30s as men coughed their lives away in sanitariums, fighting not just for breath but for the compensation they had been promised. Some died still waiting for their pensions to be approved. The use of poison gas against the Canadian Expeditionary Force was a defining moment in the nation's military history. It transformed the war from a contest of martial skill into a struggle for biological survival. It forced soldiers to confront a new kind of enemy, one that couldn't be bayoneted or outflanked, one that seeped into the lungs and stayed there for decades. And today, the brooding soldier monument at St. Julien stands as a testament to that trauma. A solitary figure, head bowed, hands resting on a reversed rifle. He doesn't celebrate victory. He mourns. He marks the place where 2,000 Canadians choked to death in the green fog of April 1915. He stands for the thousands more who carried the gas inside them long after the war ended. A reminder that some battles don't end when the guns fall silent. They echo on, in lungs, in memories, in stone. For those who returned, the war's legacy was not just physical, but psychological. The gas did more than kill, it rewired the Canadian soldier's understanding of the world around him. After Ypres, even the most ordinary elements of life felt corrupted. The air itself became suspect, something to test, to taste, to fear. Mud, once just an inconvenience of the trenches, became a reminder of how quickly a man could disappear into the landscape. The trauma lingered long after the uniforms were folded away. Veterans spoke of sudden, overwhelming dread triggered by the most harmless smells: damp hay, a whiff of bleach, a sharp bite of a cleaning solvent. These everyday scents could hurl them back into the green-yellow cloud, choking and clawing for breath. One former soldier described it as a ghost that followed you home. A chemical memory that refused to fade. For an entire generation, the war didn't end with the armistice. It lived on in the senses, in the body, in the quiet moments when the past slipped unexpectedly into the present. And this is what we now call PTSD. The story of Canadian gas warfare is also a story of science and technology, a grim duet between chemists and soldiers, each trying to stay one step ahead of the other. The battlefield became a laboratory, and the men in the trenches became unwilling test subjects in a race no one wanted to run. The landscape itself became hostile. The act of breathing became an act of courage. And this wasn't just the Canadian story. The gas war touched every army on the Western Front, and its survivors carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Jack Campbell of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers was one of Ireland's last old contemptibles. He appeared on The Late Late Show in 1988, a living link to a world that had nearly vanished. He had served with 4 of his older brothers in the Great War and had been gassed during the fighting near Mousetrap Farm in April 1915 during the Second Battle of Ypres. Chlorine had scarred his lungs like so many veterans. He carried that injury into old age. He died in 1992 at the age of 97, nearly 8 decades after the gas first touched him. Campbell's voice, like those of the Canadians who survived Ypres, reminds us that gas was not just a weapon of the moment. It was a weapon that lingered. in the soil, in the air, and in the bodies of the men who breathed it. Let's listen to Jack Campbell now.
I got gassed when my brother got killed the same day on the Somme, up in Marlincourt on the Somme. Well, I think I went grey-haired overnight worrying would I be permanently blind. I'll tell you how I got gassed in the first instance. We were on a working party this day, see, bringing stuff up to the line and that. And Jerry twigged us and he put over a shell barge. Now, there was no gas around. I had my gas mask on, hung over my right shoulder, and the gas mask was down here on my left hip. And during the barge, I got a smack in the hip. It was a real hard one because it knocked me into a trench hole about 6 feet away. But right away, I had my pants down, see what I was wounded. But I wasn't wounded, no blood or anything like that, see. Never gave it a thought. Carried on that day. Now, that night, there was a bunch of us in an old, disused German gun emplacement. Because we'd driven the Germans back, you see. And an officer came along, he said, "Hey lads," he said, "there's 10 or 12 men out there," he said, "wounded. Go out and bring them in." So of course right away we went out to get the wounded in. Now when we went out, Jerry put over gas shells. Of course as soon as you sniffed the gas, everyone shouted, "Put on your gas mask, lads." Well, I put on my gas mask and that kind of thing, the same as everybody would. And I hadn't it on about 2 minutes. And I began to get sick into my gas mask, you know. Then my ears began to pain me, and I began to find it difficult to breathe. So I either pull the blasted thing off or suffocate. So I pulled it off, of course, scattered around for a while and went down. Luckily, a lad came along just as I went down, and he said, "Where are you hit, mate?" So I said, "I'm not hit, I'm gassed." And as he bent down to help me, he said, "No wonder you're gassed, mate." He said, "There's a big piece of German shell in the metal container of your gas mask." That's what hit me early on the day.
That's what hit you.
So, of course, God, I never felt so bad. Oh, my eyes, my throat, everything like that. Well, anyway, another lad came along between them that took me down to the casualty clearance station. It was only just a little way down the reserve trenches. Now, I remember the medical officer coming on there and taking my particulars from my identity disc. But I must have been unconscious for a long time because I don't remember anything else until I was in the 2nd Canadian General Hospital down at Ypres. That was right down on the coast. And I said, "Where am I?" And somebody said, "You're in the 2nd Canadian General Hospital at Ypres, see?" Well, I must have been unconscious all that time. And it took days for me to come to the front line right down there.
The legacy of gas warfare isn't just written in official histories or carved into stone memorials. It's written in the bodies and the minds of the men who survived. The fight for recognition, for pensions, for medical care, for the simple acknowledgement that their suffering was real, became a new kind of battle. One fought not in trenches, but in government offices and hospital wards and sanatoriums. To think that these men had to go on and endure that fight for the rest of their lives is an absolute slap in the face. In my opinion, it's adding insult to injury. The hidden wound of gas exposure, invisible to the eye but devastating in its effects, became the symbol of the broader struggle of veterans to be seen, heard, and believed. And today, the story of the Canadian Expeditionary Force and chemical warfare stands as a cautionary tale. It reminds us that technology can transform not only the battlefield, but the very nature of human experience. It shows how quickly the tools of science can become instruments of terror. And it testifies to the resilience of those who endured. Men who breathed poison survived and carried the consequences for the rest of their lives. The Green Death, once unleashed, could never fully be contained. Its legacy lingers in memory, in history, and in the quiet, persistent cough of those who returned home. A reminder that some wounds never fully heal and some battles never truly end. They simply echo on, carried in the breath of the men who walked through the poisoned fields of Flanders and lived to tell the tale. Thank you so much for joining me on this late to the party, extra super long episode of Memory and Valor. There is so much that could be covered when we talk about, chemical warfare, gas warfare in the First World War. There is so much to unpack here. So in this episode, we'll leave it at that, and perhaps down the road we can look at other aspects of it. But for now, we're running a little over an hour, so we're probably out of time. Thanks again for sticking with me, for listening to this, and for having this kind of conversation. And I don't feel that it's necessarily one-sided. I hopefully have um, brought some ideas or thoughts to the forefront, and maybe it's got you thinking, or perhaps this is going to be a lead up to conversations that you may have with family, friends, colleagues, so forth. Keep the conversation going. You can visit the website at www.memoryandvalor.ca. There are books for purchase available on Amazon. There is one on the PPCLI that is available as an ebook format on Kobo. Legacy books are something that I still continue to do and will do for as long as I'm able. Legacy books being a way to preserve the history of a loved one's life in the form of a memoir, a family history. It's really customizable and very, very cool. That's available on the website as well. As always, please give this podcast a like, a follow, and a rate. Really appreciate that because it really helps get the word out there and get people thinking, get people talking again about something that a lot of us are fighting really hard to keep from slipping into the past, because let's face it, the Great War is no longer part of the collective memory. So that's what we're here for. Thanks again. Remember, keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.